The room was built to impress men who were rarely impressed. Low amber lighting washed over polished wood and velvet shadows, a place where laughter was meant to feel effortless and deals were meant to feel inevitable. On the surface, it was just another private lounge tucked behind a well-known Las Vegas casino, but anyone who had lived long enough in that city knew better. This was a room where reputations were weighed without words, where favors were remembered longer than debts, and where silence could mean more than applause. Sammy Davis Jr. felt that weight the moment he stepped inside, not because he was unfamiliar with powerful rooms, but because this one carried a tension that didn't belong to celebration. He had performed in rooms like this countless times, rooms where the smiles came too easily and the compliments arrived before the work was even done. But tonight was different. Tonight the air felt tighter, as though the walls themselves were listening. 3 men sat at a circular table near the back, their jackets still on despite the warmth, their posture relaxed in a way that only men who felt untouchable ever achieved. They were not applauding. They were not smiling. They were watching. And Sammy, with decades of experience behind him and instincts sharpened by survival, recognized that kind of watching immediately. It wasn't admiration. It was assessment. Sammy Davis Jr. had spent his entire life learning how to read rooms before rooms ever learned how to read him. He had learned it as a child performer traveling with his father, learned it on stages where applause could turn into danger depending on which door he exited, learned it backstage when contracts were offered with one hand and conditions implied with the other. He was a master at adapting, at smiling without surrendering, at standing tall even when the ground beneath him shifted without warning. But mastery didn't mean immunity. Even legends could feel the moment when something was off, when the rhythm of the night slipped out of sync. The performance itself had gone smoothly, too smoothly perhaps. The crowd responded exactly as expected, clapping on cue, laughing when laughter was safe, offering standing ovations that felt rehearsed rather than earned. Sammy gave them what they came for because professionalism demanded it, but his attention kept drifting back to that table, to the 3 men whose eyes never left him. One leaned back with a grin that never reached his eyes. Another tapped his fingers against the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if counting something only he could hear. The third said nothing at all, which worried Sammy the most. When the show ended, applause filled the room, but it felt hollow, like sound bouncing off marble. Sammy bowed, smiled, acknowledged the audience, and stepped off stage with the grace that had become second nature. Backstage, he loosened his tie slightly and took a breath, expecting the familiar rush of relief that came after a successful performance. It didn't come. Instead, a quiet unease settled in his chest, heavy and uninvited. Before he could ask his assistant what was next on the schedule, a man he didn't recognize stepped forward, blocking the hallway with a polite smile that carried no warmth. "They'd like a word," the man said calmly, nodding toward the door leading back into the lounge. There was no threat in his voice, no urgency, just an assumption that compliance was automatic. Sammy had been in this situation before, enough times to know that refusing outright could turn curiosity into offense. He straightened his jacket, nodded once, and followed. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded far louder than it should have. The room seemed smaller now, the light dimmer, the 3 men more present than before. One of them gestured toward an empty chair, not inviting, just indicating. Sammy remained standing for a moment, meeting their gazes evenly, asserting dignity through posture alone, then sat. The conversation began politely. Compliments about the performance, about talent, about longevity. Sammy responded with courtesy, choosing his words carefully, offering gratitude without obligation. Then the tone shifted, subtly at first. Questions became statements. Statements became expectations. One man leaned forward, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret, and spoke about opportunities, about protection, about how the right friends could make a career smoother, safer. Another mentioned past incidents, names of venues Sammy had played, moments that were supposed to be private but clearly were not. They weren't threatening him directly. They didn't have to. The implication was enough. Sammy felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old awareness returning, the understanding that talent alone had never been enough in places like this. He had fought too hard, endured too much to be cornered quietly now. He responded with calm deflection, reminding them that he had contracts, commitments, people who depended on clear boundaries. His voice remained steady, but inside, calculations were being made. How to exit without escalation. How to protect himself without appearing ungrateful. How to leave the room with dignity intact. Minutes stretched, the door remained closed. The men exchanged glances, subtle nods passing between them like silent agreements. One of them smiled again, wider this time, and said something that made the air go cold. "You don't seem to understand," he said gently. "This isn't a request." Sammy felt it then, the shift from conversation to confinement. Not physical yet, not overt, but unmistakable. He was no longer a guest. He was a variable they were trying to control. He glanced toward the door, then back at them, measuring distance, time, options. He had been trapped before in ways far more dangerous than locked doors, but that didn't make this moment any less real. The room had closed around him, quietly, efficiently, without drama. What none of the men at that table noticed was the change outside the lounge. Down the hall, past the murmurs of the casino floor and the lingering echoes of applause, another presence had arrived, not announced, not escorted, not seeking attention. Dean Martin moved through the space the way he always did, unhurried, unbothered, carrying himself with the ease of someone who never needed to prove he belonged. He had finished his own engagement earlier that evening, accepted the applause with a familiar grin, and slipped away before the crowd could pull him into another round of admiration. He wasn't looking for trouble. He rarely was. Trouble, however, had a way of noticing him. Dean had known Sammy Davis Jr. long enough to recognize patterns others missed. He had seen the way rooms changed when Sammy entered them, the way respect and prejudice sometimes coexisted in the same glance. He had watched doors close softly behind conversations that shouldn't have taken that long. When Dean asked casually where Sammy had gone and received an answer that felt rehearsed, something in him stirred. Not alarm exactly, but awareness. Dean Martin didn't react quickly. He reacted correctly. He took a different route through the building, bypassing security he knew by name, offering nods instead of questions, smiles instead of explanations. By the time he reached the hallway outside the private lounge, he already knew something wasn't right. The door was closed. The air was quiet. Too quiet. Dean paused, listening not for voices but for absence. Then, without knocking, without announcement, he opened the door and stepped inside. The room froze. 3 men turned simultaneously, surprise flickering across faces that were accustomed to control. Sammy looked up, disbelief flashing through his eyes for just a fraction of a second before professionalism returned. Dean Martin stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, expression calm, almost amused, as though he had walked into a room that belonged to him. He didn't ask what was happening. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the men, then at Sammy, and smiled. "Am I interrupting?" Dean asked lightly, his tone carrying no accusation, no concern, just curiosity. The kind of curiosity that shifted power without effort. One of the men began to speak, but Dean raised a hand, not sharply, not rudely, just enough to pause the moment. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate care, then pulled out a chair and sat beside Sammy as if that had always been the plan. The gesture was simple. The impact was immediate. Whatever balance the men thought they had achieved moments earlier tilted without warning. Dean leaned back, crossed his legs, and looked around the table with a familiarity that suggested history. "You know," he said casually, "I was just telling someone how funny this place can be. Doors close, conversations stretch longer than they should, misunderstandings happen." He smiled again, softer this time, but his eyes were sharp. "Figured I'd save us all some confusion." No threats were made. No names were dropped. None were needed. Dean Martin's presence carried its own weight, forged over decades of loyalty, quiet influence, and an unspoken code that he lived by without ceremony. He turned slightly toward Sammy, his voice lowering just enough to signal solidarity. "You ready to go?" he asked, as though they were leaving a dinner party early. Sammy stood. The men didn't stop them. They couldn't, not without changing the nature of the night entirely. As Dean opened the door and guided Sammy into the hallway, the tension dissolved into something quieter, heavier, unresolved. The room remained behind them, its power diminished not by confrontation but by refusal. They walked side by side down the corridor, neither speaking until they reached a place where the noise of the casino returned, where anonymity offered safety. Only then did Dean glance over, his expression shifting from casual to sincere. "You okay?" he asked. Sammy nodded slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah," he said, "because you showed up." Dean shrugged lightly, as if the answer were obvious. "That's what friends do." And in that moment, beneath the lights and the noise and the myths of Las Vegas, something far more powerful than legend revealed itself, not in spectacle, not in violence, but in presence. Quiet, steady, unmistakable. The hallway felt longer than it had any right to be, stretching forward as though the building itself needed time to understand what had just been interrupted. Sammy Davis Jr. walked beside Dean Martin in silence, their footsteps blending into the hum of the casino floor that slowly returned around them. Laughter drifted past, chips clinked, music swelled from somewhere unseen, and yet none of it touched Sammy. His mind was still in that room, still seated at that table, still watching three men calculate how much of a human being could be reduced to leverage. The body moves on before the spirit catches up, and for Sammy, the spirit lagged behind, replaying every look, every pause, every unspoken condition. Dean sensed it. He always did. He didn't fill the silence with jokes or reassurance, didn't try to lighten the moment the way others might have. He understood something many never learned, that real tension doesn't break when you talk over it, but when you give it room to release on its own. They reached a quieter corridor near the service elevators, a place performers used when they wanted to disappear without being seen. Dean stopped there, leaning casually against the wall, as though this were just another stop in an ordinary night. Sammy finally spoke, his voice low, steady on the surface, but edged with something raw beneath it. "They weren't asking," he said. "It wasn't a complaint, it was a fact." Dean nodded once. "They never do." For a moment, neither man said anything more. The weight of shared understanding settled between them, built not on rumor or fear, but on lived experience. Dean had navigated rooms like that his entire adult life, rooms where influence hid behind politeness and danger wore a tailored smile. But for Sammy, those rooms carried an extra layer, one that never fully faded no matter how famous he became. Talent opened doors. Fame softened resistance. But there were always men who believed certain boundaries didn't apply to everyone equally. They knew details, Sammy continued, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Things they shouldn't have known unless they'd been watching for a long time. Dean's expression hardened just slightly, the humor draining from his eyes. "That's how it starts," he said. "They make you feel seen before they make you feel small." Sammy let out a quiet breath, something close to a laugh but without humor. "Funny thing is," he said, "I've been underestimated my whole life. But this wasn't that. This was ownership, like they'd already decided." Dean straightened, pushing off the wall. "That's where they miscalculated." Sammy looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing not the entertainer, not the easy grin the public adored, but the man beneath. The one who had built loyalty instead of fear, who moved through power structures without needing to dominate them. "Why did you come?" Sammy asked. "Be honest." Dean didn't answer immediately. He thought for a moment, choosing truth over theatrics. "Because I noticed the room changed," he said. "And because when rooms change like that, they usually don't change back on their own." That answer settled something inside Sammy. Gratitude was there, deep and genuine, but beneath it was something more complicated, a reminder of how fragile safety could be, even for legends. He had survived far worse than an uncomfortable meeting, but survival didn't mean invulnerability. It meant learning where your allies stood. They parted shortly after, each returning to their respective circles, the night resuming its carefully choreographed illusion. To the outside world nothing had happened. No headlines were written, no whispers spread, and yet beneath the surface the interruption rippled outward, unsettling a balance that had relied on compliance. The three men in that room did not forget what had happened. Men like that never did. They recalculated. Sammy felt it in the days that followed. Calls went unanswered. Invitations that once arrived without effort were suddenly delayed or redirected. Subtle resistance crept into places that had once felt neutral. Nothing overt, nothing he could point to and say, "There, that's it." Just enough to remind him that power, once challenged, rarely withdrew without response. He continued performing, continued smiling, continued delivering excellence as he always had, but now he moved with heightened awareness. He knew eyes were still on him. Dean noticed it too, though Sammy never said a word. Dean had a way of noticing shifts in atmosphere, of sensing pressure long before it turned into force. He made a few calls, not dramatic ones, not confrontational, just conversations, reminders, clarifications. He spoke to people who spoke to other people, and slowly, quietly, the resistance softened. Not disappeared, softened. Enough to send a message without escalating the situation. One evening, weeks later, they found themselves seated together again, this time in a far less glamorous setting. A private booth at a small Italian place off the Strip, the kind of place that didn't care who you were as long as you paid the bill and respected the staff. The lighting was harsh, the table slightly uneven, the food excellent. It felt real in a way the casino never did. Sammy pushed his plate aside, appetite half gone. "You ever get tired of it?" he asked suddenly. Dean raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Managing rooms," Sammy said. "Managing people who think they're entitled to decide who you get to be." Dean smiled faintly. "That's the trick," he said. "You don't manage them, you outlast them." Sammy considered that. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Dean replied. "It's just quieter than fighting." The words lingered between them, heavy with truth. Sammy realized then that what Dean had done that night wasn't just about stepping in. It was about refusing to let the situation become a spectacle. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just presence, just alignment, just a reminder that some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed without consequences. Later that night, as Sammy returned to his hotel, he paused before entering his room, suddenly aware of how close he had come to something far worse than discomfort. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a brief moment he stood in the darkness, letting the quiet wash over him. He thought about the room that had closed around him, about how easily power could isolate someone if no one else stepped forward. And he thought about Dean, about how one calm entrance had changed the trajectory of the night without leaving a trace. What Sammy didn't know yet was that the story wasn't finished. The interruption had been noted, not just by the men at the table, but by others who had been watching from a distance. In rooms like those, every move was observed, every alliance measured. Dean's quiet defiance had shifted more than one balance, and shifts like that rarely went unanswered forever. Somewhere else in the city, a different conversation was taking place. Names were mentioned. Context was added. The question wasn't whether Sammy Davis Jr. would be approached again, but how and under what conditions. The game had changed, and games like this didn't end after a single round. For now, Sammy slept. For now, the night passed without incident. But beneath the glitter and the music, beneath the stories people told themselves about safety and success, a deeper tension continued to build, one that would test loyalty, courage, and the true cost of standing beside someone when silence would have been easier. And when that test came, it would demand more than presence. It would demand a choice. Time has a way of pretending nothing happened when, in truth, everything has already shifted. For Sammy Davis Jr., the weeks following that night carried an eerie normalcy that felt more dangerous than open hostility. Shows continued. Applause arrived on cue. Smiles were exchanged. Contracts remained intact. On the surface, life moved forward as it always had. But beneath that surface, something tighter had formed, something patient and deliberate, waiting for the right moment to apply pressure. Sammy felt it most in the quiet moments, the pauses between engagements when he was no longer insulated by music or movement. It showed up in the way conversations ended just a second too early, in how certain doors that once opened without question now required explanation. He had lived his entire life navigating invisible barriers, but this felt different. This wasn't resistance born of ignorance or prejudice alone. This was response. Someone had been interrupted, and interruptions like that created memory. Dean Martin sensed it too, though he never spoke of it directly. He had learned long ago that naming tension sometimes strengthened it. Instead, he watched. He listened. He paid attention to the small things, the sudden change in tone when Sammy's name came up, the subtle recalibration of invitations, the way certain people stopped making eye contact altogether. These weren't accidents. They were signals. The warning came one night disguised as generosity. Sammy was finishing a late rehearsal when an envelope was delivered to his dressing room. Thick paper, expensive texture, no return address. Inside was an invitation to a private after-hours gathering described as an opportunity, a chance to smooth misunderstandings, to clear the air. The language was polite, almost gracious. Too gracious. Sammy held the card in his hand for a long time, turning it over as though the weight of the paper itself might reveal intention. He had been offered reconciliation before, but never without a cost attached. He didn't call Dean right away. Pride held him back. Not arrogance, but something deeper. The desire to handle his own battles, the fear of becoming a burden, the old habit of carrying weight alone because that was how survival had once worked. He told himself he could go, listen, leave. That knowledge was power. That refusal could still be an option afterward. The gathering took place in a private residence overlooking the city, all glass and height and controlled distance from the world below. The view was spectacular, deliberately so, reminding guests of where they stood in relation to everything else. Sammy arrived alone, dressed impeccably, posture steady, mind alert. The host greeted him warmly, almost enthusiastically, as though the past weeks had been a misunderstanding both men were eager to forget. For a while it worked. Drinks were poured. Conversation stayed light. Laughter surfaced, genuine enough to blur the edges of caution. But then, slowly, the room shifted. People drifted away in pairs and clusters, leaving Sammy seated with the same three men from before, now joined by a fourth he hadn't seen before. A man who spoke less than all of them combined and carried himself like someone accustomed to outcomes. The talk returned to opportunity, to protection, to alignment. It was framed as a partnership this time, mutual benefit emphasized, threats carefully absent. But the message underneath remained unchanged. Cooperation was expected. Independence was inefficient. Sammy listened, nodding where courtesy demanded it, refusing to be rushed. When he finally spoke, his words were calm, measured, unmistakably firm. "I don't belong to anyone," he said. "I never have." The silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice could have been. The fourth man finally spoke then, his tone quiet, almost regretful. "Everyone belongs somewhere," he said. "Some people just choose how difficult that becomes." That was the moment Sammy understood that the invitation had never been about reconciliation. It was about testing resolve, about seeing whether the presence that had interrupted them once would appear again, or whether isolation would finally do the work silence couldn't. He left shortly after, excusing himself without confrontation, without agreement. The ride back to his hotel felt longer than usual, the city lights blurring into streaks as he stared out the window, replaying the conversation in his mind. He hadn't lost control. He hadn't compromised. But he hadn't escaped consequence either. The game had advanced another level. Dean was waiting in the hotel lounge when Sammy arrived. He didn't ask how the night went. He didn't need to. One look at Sammy's face told him enough. Dean gestured toward an empty chair and poured 2 drinks without asking. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that didn't demand explanation. "They reached out again," Sammy said finally. Dean nodded. "I figured they would." "I didn't agree to anything," Sammy added, a note of defiance threading through his exhaustion. "I know," Dean replied. "You wouldn't." Sammy looked at him then, frustration surfacing at last. "This keeps escalating because I won't bend," he said. "Because you stepped in, because we didn't play along." Dean met his gaze evenly. "No," he said. "It's escalating because they're not used to being told no without noise." The words landed with clarity. Dean leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering not with secrecy but with seriousness. "Listen to me," he said. "What they're really testing isn't you. It's whether standing beside you comes with a price." Sammy's jaw tightened. "And does it?" Dean smiled, not the easy public smile, but something truer. "Everything worth doing does." That night marked a quiet turning point. Dean began appearing more frequently at Sammy's engagements, not as a guard, not as a spectacle, just present. Sometimes he sat in the audience, sometimes backstage. Sometimes he simply made sure his name was associated with the room before anything else could define it. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Rooms behaved differently when Dean Martin was nearby, not because of fear, but because of memory. People remembered favors done, lines held, reputations earned the hard way. Still, pressure continued. It always did. Power didn't retreat, it adapted. Offers shifted. Messengers changed. The message remained the same. Compliance was easier than resistance. But something else had changed too. People began noticing who stood where when things became uncomfortable. They noticed who stayed silent, and they noticed who didn't. Sammy began to understand that what Dean had given him wasn't just protection. It was visibility, a signal. Standing alone made you a target. Standing together made you a question others had to answer carefully. The real test, however, was still coming. Because the men who had been interrupted that first night weren't done. They were patient, and they were preparing a moment when presence alone wouldn't be enough, when a choice would have to be made publicly, without exits, without soft lighting or quiet hallways to retreat through. A moment when legend would be weighed against loyalty. And when that moment arrived, it would decide far more than a single night in Las Vegas. There are moments in life when pressure stops building and simply arrives, fully formed, demanding a response whether one is ready or not. For Sammy Davis Jr., that moment came not in a shadowed room or behind a closed door, but under lights bright enough to erase excuses. The irony was cruel in its precision. What power could not secure quietly, it now sought to force publicly, where hesitation would be interpreted as weakness and refusal would carry a cost impossible to ignore. The event had been announced weeks in advance, a high-profile charity gala meant to celebrate unity, progress, and the golden image of entertainment's elite. Invitations were impossible to decline without explanation. Cameras would be present. Sponsors would be watching. The room would be filled with applause trained to reward appearances rather than truth. Sammy understood immediately why his name had been placed so prominently on the program. This wasn't an honor, it was positioning. Dean Martin understood too. Neither man spoke about it directly, but the tension followed them in the days leading up to the event, a low hum beneath every conversation. Sammy continued rehearsing, continued showing up with the professionalism that had defined his entire career, but something in his posture had changed. This wasn't fear. It was resolve hardened by exhaustion. He was tired of rooms deciding his worth in whispers, tired of choosing survival over self-respect, tired of being tested for how much pressure he could endure before yielding. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in spectacle. The venue shimmered with polished marble and cascading lights, every surface designed to reflect importance. Guests moved through the space in carefully measured confidence, each smile rehearsed, each handshake strategic. Sammy arrived early, as he always did, grounding himself before the noise could distort his focus. As he stepped inside, he felt it immediately, the shift. Eyes followed him longer than usual. Conversations dipped, then resumed. Somewhere in the room, decisions were already being weighed. Dean arrived separately, later than planned, unhurried as ever. His entrance didn't draw attention the way others did, yet somehow the atmosphere adjusted around him regardless. People noticed. They always did. He moved through the crowd with quiet familiarity, exchanging nods instead of greetings, his presence settling like a reminder that not all influence announced itself loudly. The program unfolded smoothly at first. Speeches were delivered. Applause came on cue. Sammy was called to the stage for recognition, his name met with cheers that sounded sincere enough to hide the calculation beneath them. He stood beneath the lights, the room stretching out before him, faces blending into a single expectant expression. He accepted the honor with grace, thanked the organizers, spoke briefly about gratitude and resilience. Nothing controversial, nothing confrontational. Then the moment arrived. Another speaker took the stage, someone whose authority in the room was unquestioned, whose words carried weight beyond the microphone. He spoke of unity, of cooperation, of how progress required alignment and understanding. Then, without naming names, he pivoted. He spoke of responsibility, of loyalty, of how success came with expectations. His gaze landed on Sammy for just a second too long, the implication unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The room went still. Sammy felt it, the narrowing of options, the tightening of space. This was the test. This was the moment designed to corner him in front of witnesses, to invite a response that would either signal compliance or expose defiance. If he nodded, smiled, played along, the pressure would ease. If he didn't, consequences would follow, quietly at first, then louder. Sammy stepped forward again, returning to the microphone without being invited. The movement alone disrupted the rhythm of the evening. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Dean straightened slightly where he sat, eyes fixed on the stage, expression unreadable. Sammy stood there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the shift in tone. "I've been part of this industry my entire life," he said. "I've given it everything I have, my talent, my time, my trust, and I've learned something important along the way." He paused, scanning the room, not searching for approval but acknowledging presence. Unity isn't built by pressure. Loyalty isn't earned through expectation. And respect, he said, letting the word settle, is not something you negotiate. The silence that followed was absolute. No applause, no interruption, just the sound of truth landing where it wasn't supposed to. Sammy stepped back, nodding once, and left the stage without waiting for a response. The program resumed awkwardly, speakers shuffled, the rhythm broken beyond repair. But the damage had already been done, not to Sammy, but to the illusion that control could be exercised without challenge. Backstage, the tension caught up with him all at once. The weight of what he had just done pressed against his chest, not as regret, but as awareness. He had drawn a line in a place where lines were meant to blur. He had made a choice that could not be undone quietly. Dean found him there, moments later. He didn't congratulate him. He didn't offer reassurance. He simply stood beside him, close enough to be seen, close enough to matter. "You said what needed to be said," Dean remarked calmly. Sammy let out a breath that felt like it had been held for years. "Now comes the cost," he replied. Dean nodded. "Now comes the truth." The fallout didn't take long. Invitations stalled. Deals slowed. Whispers returned, sharper this time, edged with frustration rather than curiosity. But something else happened too. People who had watched that moment began to choose sides quietly, carefully. Some pulled away. Others stepped closer. Not loudly, not publicly, but in ways that counted. Sammy realized then that power didn't always retaliate with force. Sometimes it tested endurance, hoping time would erode conviction. But endurance was something Sammy knew intimately. He had been practicing it his entire life. One evening, weeks later, he and Dean sat together again, this time not in a lounge or a restaurant, but on a quiet terrace overlooking the city. The lights below flickered like distant stars, beautiful and indifferent. Sammy broke the silence first. "If you hadn't been there," he said slowly, "I don't know if I would have said it." Dean considered that. "You would have," he said. "Maybe later, maybe differently, but you would have." Sammy shook his head. "Standing alone feels different when you know someone else watching your back." Dean smiled faintly. "That's the thing about standing beside someone," he said. "It doesn't make the weight disappear. It just reminds you you're not carrying it by yourself." What neither man said aloud was that the choice had already reshaped their paths. Lines had been drawn. Reputations had shifted. And somewhere, those who relied on silence and pressure were realizing something dangerous. The rules had changed. And the next move would not be subtle.